4 years ago, I released a video talking about Deno, which was kind of like the Node.js replacement. It was written by the creator of Node.js, and it was meant to modernize Node.js and make it better. In that video, I pretty much talked about how I really liked a lot of the features in Deno, but it really wasn't ready for production use because it was pretty much brand new. Well, now, 4 years later, Deno is releasing version 2.0, which comes with a lot of really important features that make it lean more towards production ready. In this video, I want to talk about whether Deno is ready for production, if it's going to replace Node.js, and when I think you should probably use it. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name is Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream projects sooner. Now, you may have seen recently I released a video talking about Node.js, how they released a bunch of new features over the last couple years, which really revolutionize and modernize it. And a lot of these features ideas they actually got from Deno. If we take a look at some of the features that are already existing in Deno, one of my favorite ones is it supports TypeScript natively. This is one thing that Node.js has never done, and even now they have an experimental feature in Node.js to be able to support TypeScript, but it doesn't actually do any type checking or anything like that. All it does is remove your TypeScript from your TypeScript code and convert it over to JavaScript. So it's a very bare bones implementation. There's no type checking or anything. While with Deno, everything related to TypeScript is built in by default. You can run TypeScript files. It has TypeScript checking and everything that you'd possibly want. This to me is incredibly important because as you can see this line right here, you don't need to write any tsconfig or any transpilation. All it does is it just reads your TypeScript code and runs your code just fine. This is honestly one of my favorite features of Deno, and it's been around since the very beginning. Another thing about Deno that I really like is it essentially has everything you need built into the tool. So most of the time, if you're working with JavaScript, you need something like Vite or Next.js to do all of your bundling, and like Webpack to do your bundling and configuring and formatting and linting and so on, ESLint, Prettier, all that different stuff. Deno has all of that built in. They have testing built in, they have linting built in, they have formatting built in, they have type checking built in, benchmarking, compiling. All of that stuff you need is built in, so you don't need Prettier, you don't need ESLint, you don't need all of these additional libraries. Now, Node.js does have some of these things. For example, Node.js does have testing built into it, so that's a little bit comparable right there. But when you need things like linting and formatting and so on, you obviously need to reach to other tools for that. And this is why a lot of times in a Node.js-based JavaScript project, when you start it up, you're going to have a ton of different files for like an ESLint config, a Prettier config, a TypeScript config, and all these files really clutter up your actual code base, and they're annoying to set up the very first time that you work on it, which is why you'll usually use a tool like Vite or something to do that bundling for you. But with Deno, all that's built in, and it's been around since the early days of Deno. If I scroll down a little ways, you can kind of see the comparison between what you run in Node and what you run in Deno. And as you can see, pretty much everything you can do in Node, you can do in Deno, and you don't need extra libraries. For example, here you can see they have like ESLint and Prettier and TypeScript and TypeDoc and Jest and all these different things, while all of those have a Deno equivalent. Another really nice thing about Deno that's again been around since the early days is it's very focused on conforming with the basic web APIs that are built into the web, things like fetch and promises, URL, request, response. I've noticed looking at a lot of newer Node.js libraries like Next.js, they're all kind of converting from the Node.js way of doing things to trying to be more web platform APIs that are just built into the web browsers and so on. So this is something Deno has done from the beginning, and Node.js is slowly working on moving its way there, but it's incredibly slow and honestly probably will never truly get there just because of how many legacy things are built on the older way of doing things in Node.js. So this is another thing I really like about Deno is if you understand how these things work in a web-based environment, you're going to understand how they work inside of Deno. Now that covers the things that are already existing in Deno. So I want to talk about some of the new things in Deno, which are actually the things that are really interesting to me. So if we look at what's new, by far the biggest and coolest thing is that it now has full backwards compatibility with Node and NPM. This means if you have an NPM package you want to install, you can use it directly inside of Deno. This is obviously the biggest pushback for a lot of people originally is, okay, there's a million NPM libraries out there that are incredibly useful. I want to use them, but if I'm using Deno, I can't use them. Well, now that is essentially an issue of the past. You may still run into particular issues, but a lot of these issues can be fixed just by running Deno lint fix, and it's going to automatically apply any fixes you need to be able to make sure that your code is going to work in Deno, even if you're using certain Node.js or NPM packages. Deno can even go ahead and it can read from your package JSON and your Node modules to figure out all the different packages that you're using inside of your project. So you don't even need to convert from using like NPM and stuff like that. It can just work with all that out of the box, which is really nice because it means you can take an existing Node.js project and port it over to Deno relatively easily. Deno also supports things like Next.js, Svelte, and so on, which is really nice because now if you want to create like a Next.js project, for example, you can do so with Deno, and it's actually relatively easy. You just run essentially 3 lines of code and it's up and running almost exactly the same as if you did it using Next.js instead. It's essentially the exact same process with Deno. Now, before I start talking about some of the other new features, I do want to talk about some of the potential drawbacks of this. One thing that I noticed, I started playing around with this Deno 2. I was working with a release candidate version because the full version of Deno 2 hasn't been released until essentially the minute that this video is coming out live to you. So I was working with the release candidate version, and I was able to get started up no problem on a completely fresh Next.js application using Deno. Absolutely no problems. Took me literally less than a minute to get started with, which was amazing. That was super cool. But when I tried to port over a not even massive project, but a relatively large project, it's coming out on the channel in a couple weeks. Essentially, it's a Calendly clone. And I ported that over to Deno, and everything in the application was pretty much working fine, but I was using Clerk as my authentication, and the Clerk library did not work very well with Deno. I had a lot of bugs showing up, I got errors showing up in my code. I just couldn't run it using Clerk inside of Deno. And I looked into the Clerk source code because it was somewhere really deep buried in the Clerk source code. It was calling something that was not compatible with Deno. I spent about 15 minutes diving into it and couldn't really figure out what the issue was, but I wasn't looking super deep. And again, I'm using a release candidate version, so I'm not 100% sure the differences between the real Deno 2 coming out versus what I was using. It may be fixed in that time period, but this is something to watch out for. If you're working on a relatively large project and you want to port it over from Node.js to Deno, you may run into some compatibility issues. Now, hopefully these will be fixed over time as more and more people start trying this out. It's one of these things it's releasing essentially today, so you're going to have the earliest version of it, and over time, hopefully those different bugs will be fixed. But it is something I want you to be aware of because this is a potential problem. If you're working on a large scale project with a team, converting over to Deno may not be something that's feasible for you. But there are a lot of features in Deno that make it so that you can actually work with larger projects. Speaking of some of these new features, we have the ability to deal with private NPM registries, which is super important if you're working with any enterprise level teams. And same thing here, we have monos, repos, and workspaces. Again, something that's very useful when you're working on larger, more enterprise scale projects. So this just makes it so that Deno is more usable in these enterprise situations. They also include long-term support now, which again is super important if you're in an enterprise situation. You want to have that long-term support so you're not constantly updating to the latest and greatest version, but you want to still be able to get security updates for a long time coming. Now, another thing that I think is really cool is JSR. Essentially, it's a TypeScript version of NPM, which I think is super cool. So now essentially it's built on top of NPM, so everything in NPM is going to work just like normal. You can deploy packages just like you normally will with NPM, but it just has additional features built on top of it to work natively with TypeScript, which is really cool because now it just makes that whole TypeScript working experience easier. You don't have to transpile your code from TypeScript to JavaScript using a bundler and then deploy that and then have people ingest that and then actually get the types. Everything is just built in perfectly, so you can deploy TypeScript to this NPM-like module. People can download that TypeScript and just run it just fine in their code base, which makes actually reading the code easier because, as you know, if you pull down a package from NPM that's written in TypeScript and you want to look at what that code looks like, all the code's going to be in JavaScript, and the only thing that you're going to be able to look at is the TypeScript definitions of the actual types. You're not able to look at the actual code itself other than the compiled JavaScript code. So having this where you can just look at the native TypeScript code exactly as it was written by the developer, I think is really cool. It also does some things with helping auto-generate documentation and stuff for you based on how you write your code with like JSDoc and things like that. So that's another really nice thing because a lot of times if you're working with a library inside of NPM and you hover over the code to see what it does, a lot of times you're not going to have any documentation. So this just helps you with a little bit of generation and helps you with showing what that actually looks like. Now, kind of the final thing that Deno does that it sets itself apart from Node.js is they have a standard library. This is something a lot of people have been asking for a very long time, to have a standard library built into JavaScript. And JavaScript's been pushing back for the longest time, and you just want a standard library to do certain things. For example, testing is something you'd want to be able to do in a standard library. Lodash is a library that a lot of people install because it includes a lot of really helpful utilities for dealing with arrays, objects, and so on, and that's something that is not built into JavaScript, but Deno has that built into their standard library. And Deno has a massive standard library. This is just a couple of them. Essentially, it has, I think, listed here over 30 different modules that cover pretty much everything you would want to do in web development built directly into Deno, and you can just import the ones you need and use them. So this is really nice because now instead of installing 10 different modules to do these different things, you just have the standard library that does all of them for you. So now we can kind of get to the question of, is Deno actually ready for production use? Well, if you wanted to use Deno inside of Next.js to create a brand new application, you literally run these 3 lines of code. It's that simple. And I tested this out. It works flawlessly and is really nice because Deno is actually quite fast and it does a lot of things that are really nice built in, like we've talked about. But am I going to create a Next.js application using Deno? And the answer to that is it really depends. If I'm working on a smaller project that I don't care about if I run into weird edge cases for particular things, then yes, I'm perfectly okay with using Deno to get those extra performance wins and just to try it out because it's kind of fun to work with. But if I'm working on a serious project where I'm actually got like money on the line, or maybe I really want to focus on just building the project and I don't have the time to be able to spend fixing potential edge cases that come in, I'm probably just going to stick with NPM and Node to build my Next.js project. And that's because Next.js is a rather large application. There's a lot of pieces that go inside of it, especially when you start installing different libraries. And the odds of one of those libraries or different pieces clashing with Deno is at least high enough that it has a potential problem. Like I said, I ran into a problem using the clerk library with Deno, and that's something that I wouldn't want to have to worry about when I'm building out an application. Now, if I really wanted to use Deno for a web application, I would just use the Fresh framework, which is like Deno's version of Next.js as their own web framework built specifically on Deno, specifically with Deno libraries. And this is going to be honestly the best experience you're going to get with Deno because everything is built around Deno. But now we can kind of get to the next point of what if I want to build something out that's going to be a Node project, but it's not necessarily like a Next.js or React project. It's just a Node project. Maybe it's like a backend, like an Express backend, but obviously using Deno tools instead, or maybe it's even just a command line utility. In those particular scenarios, I would actually probably reach towards Deno over top of Node.js. And the reason for that is just because Deno has a lot of those nice built-in features. It's really easy to use TypeScript. It's got formatting and linting built in. It has a standard library that has some really handy command line tools built into it. So it makes working with the command line easier when you're writing a command line tool. And if you're just building a basic Node.js application, or in this case, a Deno application using JavaScript, you're probably not installing nearly as many libraries. So there are less chances that you're going to have a conflict between the libraries you're installing and the actual Deno code that you're running. So if I'm working with just a strict Node.js application or a JavaScript application, I'm probably going to reach towards Deno over Node.js in those specific scenarios. Now, I'm not nearly as confident with Deno as I am with Node.js, for example, so it may be slower for me to build that application at first, but once I get that skill level with Deno, I could see myself building applications in Deno quicker than I could in Node.js just because of those built-in features, the TypeScript and so on that's built in, and Deno in general is just faster than Node.js. Now, Deno 2 probably isn't going to overtake Node.js just because Node.js is so cemented into everything that we build with JavaScript, but just the fact that Deno exists is enough to make Node.js actually so much better. All these new features I've talked about that have come to Node.js over the last few years are almost a direct result of Deno implementing those features first. If it weren't for Deno pushing the envelope on what's possible, Node.js would have no incentive to actually work on and implement those features, and I guarantee you many of those amazing features that are in Node.js right now probably wouldn't even be there. And Deno is constantly pushing the envelope of what's possible and making it so that all other JavaScript libraries benefit by being forced to include those features or fall behind and have Deno overtake them. And if you want to see a video talking about all of those new Node.js features, I'm going to have it linked right over here. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.